Something huge has changed in the housing market in Canada and many other countries around the world. Something that's reshaping our cities, pricing out entire generations, and making homeownership feel like an impossible dream. And yet, every time we ask why, we hear the same excuse. There just aren't enough homes. We're told that if cities just loosened zoning laws and lowered taxes and fees for builders, they could ramp up construction, home prices would fall, rents would stabilize, and affordability would return. But here's the problem. Home prices are skyrocketing in every major city, even in places building more than ever before. So what's really going on? The real story isn't just about supply. It's about who owns homes, why they own them, and a fundamental conflict at the center of this crisis. Do we want homes to be places where Canadian households can build their lives and plan for retirement like past generations did? Or should they be profit machines for the wealthiest investors? And should Canada's addiction to real estate investing continue to come at the expense of other more productive sectors, which could return Canada to the top of global economic competitiveness? Now let's start with the numbers. A few decades ago, a home in Toronto or Vancouver cost around 4 or 5 times the average household income. Today, that number is well into the double digits, and yet politicians and economists keep telling us this is just about supply, that cities aren't allowing builders to build fast enough. But if that were true, why did home prices explode across the world at the exact same time? Why are cities that are building more still seeing home values and rents spiral out of control? Historically, different countries have taken different approaches to housing. Some have treated it as a social right, ensuring affordability through public housing, rent controls, or policies that limit speculation. Others have leaned into housing as an investment, where rising home prices are encouraged as a way to grow personal and national wealth. Canada, like many other countries, has shifted firmly towards the second model. Our policies don't just allow housing to be a financial asset, they actively encourage it. Easy credit, tax incentives, and government-backed mortgages have helped turn homes into one of the most profitable investments on the planet. But in the process, we've lost sight of something critical. The more profitable housing becomes, the less affordable it is for the people who actually need it. This is why traditional ideas of affordability, like home prices staying within reach of local incomes, no longer apply, because the people setting the market are not looking for a place to live. They're not constrained by income. They're buying with capital, and they're looking for the highest return. Economic experts love to talk about supply and demand, the idea that when prices go up, demand falls. But housing doesn't quite work like that because shelter isn't optional. When home prices rise, people don't stop needing a place to live. Instead, they stretch their budgets, take on more debt, or get priced out into the rental market, driving rents even higher. And because investors see homes as a financial asset, rising prices don't scare them away. They attract more buyers looking to cash in. This is why during the biggest housing booms, home sales actually increase when prices are rising, because more investors rush in looking to capitalize on price gains. In the rest of this video, we're going to unpack this shift in detail, how we got here, who benefits, and what can actually be done to fix it. So stick around because we have a lot to cover. To understand how Canada's housing market became so broken, we first need to go back to a time when housing was not a national concern, when there were no policies to make homeownership easier, and when the government saw little reason to intervene in housing at all. In the early 1900s, the federal government did virtually nothing to support housing for Canadians. There's no national housing policy because at the time, there was no belief that one was needed. People were largely responsible for securing their own shelter, and the government took a hands-off approach. As former CMHC President George Anderson put it, at Confederation, we shared roughly the same housing circumstances. Most of it was crummy, but because everyone was in the same boat, few thought they were disadvantaged. But by the time of the First World War, housing pressures had started to mount. For the first time, the government was forced to intervene, not because it saw housing as a priority, but because wartime conditions demanded it. Temporary measures were introduced to assist households affected by the war, and after the war, housing was used as a tool to stimulate economic growth. It wasn't until 1938, during the Great Depression, that Canada took its first major step toward an active housing policy. The National Housing Act was introduced, marking a shift from the government's hands-off approach to a growing recognition that housing was a national issue. After the Second World War, Canada was dealing with a severe housing shortage. Over 1 million soldiers were returning home, and hundreds of thousands of Canadians were living in substandard conditions. The country needed a massive housing effort to keep up with demand. In response, the federal government expanded its role, but its focus remained on stimulating the economy, viewing housing as a way to create jobs and drive post-war recovery. Many in government still resisted the idea of directly investing in social or subsidized housing. At the time, there's a widespread belief that poverty and housing struggles were personal issues, not systemic ones. Unlike European countries, which invested heavily in public housing before and after the war, Canada was hesitant to go down that road. Instead of investing in large-scale government housing, Canada took a different approach, one that would shape the housing market for decades to come. The government didn't focus on building homes for people, it focused on helping people buy homes themselves. In 1954, a major shift made homeownership more accessible. The federal government reduced the minimum down payment to 10% and allowed charter banks to lend directly to homebuyers. For the first time, a wider segment of the population had access to mortgage financing. By the 1970s, Canada's homeownership rate had surged from 40% to over 60%. But while homeownership was growing, rental housing was still lagging behind. In the 1960s, the government recognized that focusing only on homeownership wasn't enough. They introduced tax incentives to encourage apartment construction, leading to a surge in rental housing development. And by the 1970s, another shift occurred. The government began investing in non-market and subsidized housing for lower-income Canadians. For the first time, the government played a major role in ensuring that housing was available for all income levels, not just for those who could afford to buy. And in just a few decades, Canada's approach to housing had completely transformed. It had gone from a country that saw housing as purely a private market concern to one where the government played an active role in shaping home ownership, rental development, and social housing. But this era of housing expansion wasn't built to last. The policies that had made homeownership accessible, spurred rental development, and created affordable housing were about to be tested by shifting economic and political priorities. The 1990s were a difficult time for Canada's economy and for the federal government. With a mounting debt crisis, Ottawa was desperate to cut spending. And one of the biggest casualties of these cuts, housing. Under Brian Mulroney and later Jean Chrétien, the federal government completely withdrew from funding affordable housing. Tax incentives that had encouraged rental construction were eliminated, and government investment in new housing projects was slashed. This was a turning point. For decades, the government had played an active role in shaping Canada's housing market. Now it was stepping back, leaving housing almost entirely in the hands of private developers and the free market. At the same time, Ottawa wasn't just cutting back, it was actively reshaping the housing market. And instead of investing in rental housing, the government doubled down on home ownership. In 1992, the federal government introduced the Home Buyers Plan, allowing Canadians to withdraw money from their retirement savings to buy a home. It was a politically popular move, but more importantly, it didn't cost the government a cent. But this wasn't just about helping people buy homes. It was part of a larger shift, one that saw home ownership as a long-term retirement strategy. With baby boomers reaching their peak earning years, the government needed a plan to manage their future financial security. Instead of funding expensive retirement programs like many European countries, policymakers encouraged Canadians to invest in their homes, seeing real estate as a way for individuals to secure their own financial future. As economists John Doling and Richard Ronald explain, rather than relying on state-managed social transfers to counter the risks of poverty, individuals accept greater responsibility for their own welfare by investing in financial products and property assets. This approach, known as asset-based welfare, became the unspoken foundation of Canada's housing policies moving forward. At the same time, another major shift was taking place, one that would change how Canadians used their homes forever. The 1990s fiscal crisis meant the government couldn't afford to stimulate the economy through public spending. So instead, they turned to homeowners. Their plan? Encourage Canadians to borrow against their homes. Enter the Home Equity Line of Credit, or HELOC. A HELOC is a line of credit that gives homeowners access to the equity in their home, effectively using their home like an ATM. For many, this meant suddenly having access to hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend however they wanted. And it worked. HELOC balances soared from $35 billion in 2000 to $186 billion 10 years later. Homeowners borrowed to renovate, spend, and invest. But something changed. What started as a way to stimulate the economy turned into a wealth-building strategy. When home prices started rising again in the early 2000s, homeowners suddenly had access to massive amounts of home equity. And instead of just using it for renovations or consumer spending, many started using it to buy more homes. And here's how it works. A homeowner sees their property value increase. Then they refinance or use a HELOC to extract cash for that property. They use that cash to make a down payment on an investment property. And then that new property appreciates in value, allowing them to repeat the process. This cycle transformed housing from a basic necessity into a perpetual wealth machine for those already in the market, further driving up home prices and locking out new buyers. In just a couple of decades, Canada's housing market was no longer about shelter. It became a financial engine for those who already owned homes to buy even more. As Statistics Canada put it, real estate and homes are no longer just a place to live. Instead, Canadians are in the business of real estate. This shift was facilitated by our government's introduction of mortgage-backed securities, a system that allowed banks to package and sell mortgages as financial products. This freed up banks to lend more, making mortgages more accessible. And here's where things get interesting. The government wasn't just insuring mortgages for first-time buyers anymore. Banks were allowed and able to insure and securitize mortgages on investment properties, shifting financial risk from lenders to taxpayers. And this is why mortgage securitization matters. It transformed housing into an investment machine. More credit means more demand, and more demand means higher prices. Housing markets don't operate in a vacuum. Beyond supply and demand, beyond government incentives and tax policies, there's another powerful force shaping home prices: monetary policy. Now, monetary policy refers to money and financial systems typically managed by central banks like the Bank of Canada to control inflation interest rates and economic stability. And over the past 2 decades, decisions made by central banks have played a critical role in turning homes from places to live into speculative financial assets. The first major shift came in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis. To prevent total economic collapse, central banks, including the US Federal Reserve and the Bank of Canada, took unprecedented steps to stabilize financial markets. Interest rates were slashed to near zero levels, making borrowing cheaper than ever. At the same time, the Federal Reserve launched an aggressive program known as quantitative easing, or QE, buying trillions of dollars in long-term government bonds and mortgage-backed securities to drive down long-term interest rates. In Canada, while the Bank of Canada didn't engage in QE at the time, the spillover effects from the US were significant. Cheap money flooded global markets, and housing became one of the biggest beneficiaries. As interest rates plummeted, housing wasn't just attractive to local buyers and investors, it became a prime investment for global capital. Wealthy investors, including corporations, started parking their money in real estate, not just in their own countries, but in markets perceived as stable and safe, like Canada. Housing offered higher returns than traditional investments like bonds or savings accounts, and with interest rates near zero, the cost of borrowing was negligible. Suddenly, real estate wasn't just about shelter. It was a financial instrument, a way to build wealth. If the 2008 crisis set the stage for housing to become a financial asset, the COVID-19 pandemic supercharged it. As the world went into lockdown, central banks reacted with even more aggressive policies to prevent an economic collapse. In Canada, the Bank of Canada slashed its policy rate to 0.25%, the lowest in history. And for the first time, the Bank of Canada did engage in quantitative easing, buying government and corporate bonds to inject liquidity into the economy. The goal was to keep borrowing cheap, encourage spending, and prevent a financial crisis. But it had unintended consequences. It created a tidal wave of demand in housing markets globally. This new wave of investment drove prices up even further, making it even harder for regular buyers to compete. Housing was no longer just about local supply and demand. It was now a global financialized asset. In Canada, this cycle has created an environment where home prices have outpaced income growth for 2 straight decades. Buying a home is no longer just about saving for a down payment. It's about competing with investors who have access to cheap credit and the ability to leverage real estate as an asset class. And while these monetary policies may have been necessary to stabilize economies during the times of crisis, they have also made housing markets less stable, less accessible, and have widened wealth inequalities. Meet the new face of Canada's housing market. A couple in Vancouver keeping a condo as a rental after upgrading to a house. A nurse in North Bay working overtime not to save for her RSP, but to buy rental properties. A global pop star purchasing a mansion through a holding company. A former Bank of Canada governor backing a business that lets renters buy a small share of a home owned by a big corporation. What do they all have in common? They're all investors. Real estate investors aren't just corporate landlords. They're everyday Canadians, small business owners, celebrities, and even politicians. And over the last 30 years, their role in the housing market has radically changed. Not all investors are the same. Some fund new housing developments, helping create supply. Others, the ones we're focused on, aren't adding anything new to the market. They're buying homes that were meant to be owner-occupied and turning them into rental investments. To paraphrase economist John Maynard Keynes, these are functionless investors. Not because they don't make money, but because their profits come from extracting value, not creating value. They aren't increasing the number of homes available, they're recycling existing housing stock into investment vehicles, turning homes that once provided long-term stability into assets designed for maximizing returns. And in the process, they're making it even harder for first-time buyers to enter the market. So, how many homes are actually owned by investors? According to Statistics Canada, investors own over a third of homes in the Maritimes, 25% in British Columbia, and 24% in Ontario, Manitoba. But this doesn't tell us how investor ownership has changed over time. Between 2006 and 2011, the number of houses rented out as investment properties across Canada increased by a modest 8.5%. But between 2011 and 2021, that number surged by 31%, growing 3.4 times faster than the total housing stock. The Bank of Canada tracks the share of homes bought by different types of buyers: first-time buyers, repeat buyers, and investors. And since 2014, the share of homes bought by first-time buyers and repeat buyers has declined, while the investor share has risen from 20% to 30%. Investors have not been constrained by the same financial challenges as families, allowing them to capture a growing portion of the housing market. Investors play a particularly dominant role in Canada's condominium market. In Ontario, they own 43% of all condo units and 57% of those built after 2016. In British Columbia, they own 37% of all condo units and 49% of newer ones. But it's not just condos. Row houses and semi-detached homes, traditionally the most affordable low-rise housing, are increasingly being bought by investors. And this has real consequences for today's buyers. Despite Toronto building over 250,000 new low-rise homes since 2006, the number of homes listed for sale each year is declining because more homes are owned by investors, meaning fewer are available for first-time buyers. Meanwhile, the number of homes listed for lease has surged, showing that homes that could have been bought by families are instead becoming rental properties. This shift has begun to show in homeownership rates. As investor activity accelerated, Canada's homeownership rate began to decline after 2011, as more of our homes are owned by investors and fewer of them are owned by families. But how did we get here? Canada's rising share of investor-owned home isn't an accident. It's the result of deliberate policy choices. The federal government sees investors as part of the solution, not the problem. The former housing minister, Ahmed Hussen, defended investors, saying small-time landlords provide rental stock to Canadian families. But is this the best way to ensure affordable housing? When Canada faced a housing crisis after World War II, the government built new homes for families. But today our response is different. Young buyers must compete not just with other families, but with well-capitalized investors, including institutional investors and even politicians. This has turned housing into a financial battleground rather than a path to stability for families. When investors flood the market, prices rise faster. Investors who have more financial resources than first-time buyers are able to outbid families, driving prices higher. We saw this dynamic play out in Toronto in 2016 and 2021 when investor demand pushed prices up by over 30% in a single year. These booms weren't driven by families looking for a home. They were driven largely by investors. Investor dominance doesn't just affect prices, it also shapes what gets built. In Toronto, investors overwhelmingly buy pre-construction condos, which has led to a market dominated by small units optimized for investor returns rather than family living. Canada's urban centers are now filled with micro condos while family-sized housing remains scarce. Today's younger Canadians face far higher barriers to home ownership than previous generations, locking them into renting while older generations accumulate wealth. But now we need to talk about an even bigger force: corporate investors. These are massive billion-dollar institutions leveraging technology and data to buy up homes before the average buyer even has a chance. Before the 2008 financial crisis, single-family home investments were largely dominated by small mom-and-pop landlords. Institutional investors rarely purchased single-family homes. Managing thousands of individual properties was simply too complex and inefficient. But after the global financial crisis, everything changed. One of the key enablers of this shift, technology. Companies like Amherst Capital have built sophisticated algorithms that scan every home as soon as it's listed for sale. As Amherst explains, each morning we have a bid list of targeted properties with projected returns automatically run before anybody has even had time to put on the coffee. Every day, these companies analyze thousands of homes, evaluating everything from expected rent yields to neighborhood demographics. This allows them to identify and bid on the best homes instantly, locking out families who are still trying to book a viewing. Despite this growing corporate presence, many housing experts argue that institutional investors don't really impact affordability. Their reasoning? These firms only own a small percentage of the total housing stock. But this is a misleading way to look at the problem. What matters is how many homes they're buying each year in the regions where they operate. And we can see how they're impacting markets in the United States where sales data is more available. According to the National Association of Realtors, in 2021, corporate investors purchased 28% of all homes sold in Texas, 19% in Georgia, and 18% in Alabama and Oklahoma. And in some counties, they accounted for more than half of all transactions. When housing experts say they only own a small share of homes nationally, they're intentionally hiding the huge impact they're having in the local markets where they operate. And it's not just about home prices. Corporate investors are also manipulating rent. Many of the largest institutional landlords use a software platform called RealPage. This tool collects rental data from competing landlords and recommends higher rents across the board. This isn't competition, it's collusion. In some cases, RealPage's algorithm tells landlords to intentionally leave units vacant to keep rents high. In Atlanta, tenants are paying an estimated $181 more per month because of these tactics. No free market sets prices this way. This is corporate price fixing. Canada is several years behind the US on this trend, but we're already seeing institutional investors ramp up their purchases. Core Development Group recently announced plans to buy 10,000 homes in Ontario. Should we care? Many housing economists say no, that it's no different than small investors buying homes or large companies purchasing apartment buildings. But is that really the case? Institutional investors have always owned purpose-built rental apartment buildings. When an apartment building sold, it simply transfers from one investor to another, having no impact on home ownership opportunities. But when a corporate investor buys 10,000 single-family homes, the story is different. Unlike purpose-built rentals, these are the very same homes that young families are trying to buy. When a billion-dollar corporation enters the market, they outbid regular buyers, driving prices up and permanently reducing the number of homes available for ownership. And it's not just about today's prices. When these homes are bought by institutional investors, they don't cycle back into the market like they might with smaller landlords. If a mom and pop investor loses interest in being a landlord, they'll eventually sell the home, making it available for a family to buy. But when corporate landlords decide to exit the market, they don't sell individual homes. They sell entire portfolios to other institutional investors. These homes are permanently removed from the pool of homes that families can own. And as the supply of owner-occupied homes shrinks, home prices are pushed even higher, not just because of lower supply, but because the homes that are for sale are increasingly being bought by wealthier households and investors who can outbid first-time buyers. Now, some economists argue that corporate investors create rental supply and provide a valuable service. But let's be clear, these companies aren't creating any new housing. They're taking homes that used to or otherwise would have belonged to families and turning them into corporate rental properties. This shift has fundamentally changed how home prices are set. In the post-World War II era, families drove demand for housing, meaning home prices were constrained by household incomes. But today, large investors are buying homes with capital, not income. While first-time buyers need years to save for a down payment, these firms raise hundreds of millions of dollars from Bay Street and Wall Street to fund their acquisitions. How can a young family compete with that? They can't. And that's why we now have this bizarre dichotomy. Housing feels increasingly unaffordable for working families, while at the same time, major investment firms are advertising single-family homes as a lucrative investment opportunity for institutional investors. And this is the reality of today's housing market. Home prices aren't being set by income anymore. They're being driven by capital. And the more corporations buy up homes, the more difficult it becomes for regular families to ever own one. We've talked about large corporations buying up homes, but there's another group that rarely gets mentioned, the small corporate investor. While they don't buy tens of thousands of homes at a time, their collective impact on housing and the economy is just as important. So who are all these small corporate investors? Well, many are entrepreneurs, small business owners, consultants, real estate agents, and even doctors, people who earn their income through a corporation they own and control. And the key advantage they have, taxes. In Ontario, small corporations are taxed at just 12%, far lower than personal income tax rates. This allows corporate owners to save money inside their business at a lower tax rate, making it far easier to save for a down payment. And in fact, many high net worth individuals buy their primary homes through corporations just to take advantage of these tax benefits. Take Canadian rapper Drake, for example. He bought his Toronto Bridle Path mansion through a holding company. Why? Because buying through a corporation allowed him to avoid paying personal income tax on the money used for the purchase. If he had, say, withdrawn $6 million from his company to buy the home personally, he would have had to pay taxes, leaving him with roughly $3.5 million. By purchasing through a corporation, he effectively avoided paying $2.5 million in taxes today. Now, most people aren't buying $6 million mansions, but the principle is the same. Entrepreneurs buying homes through corporations get a massive tax advantage over regular salaried workers who must save for a down payment after paying personal income tax. This means two people earning the same income, one through a salary, the other through a corporation, will have vastly different opportunities when it comes to home ownership. The corporate buyer can accumulate savings much faster and has a built-in financial edge. But this isn't just a housing issue, it's an economic issue. By encouraging entrepreneurs to invest in houses instead of businesses, Canada is actively reducing productivity and innovation. Business owners will tell you it's easier and more lucrative to buy investment properties than to reinvest in their companies. And banks, they'd rather lend to them for real estate than for business expansion. Instead of fueling entrepreneurship and job creation, Canada's policies are incentivizing business owners to sink capital into real estate, driving home prices up and diverting investment away from innovation and productivity. For years, economists and housing advocates have argued that if we just let builders build, home prices will stay affordable. Now, the theory is simple. In cities where zoning laws are relaxed, builders can rapidly increase supply, keeping prices from rising too quickly. And for over 25 years, this theory held up. In U.S. cities where it's easy to build, home prices grew at a slower rate than the national average. When demand increased, builders bought land and built more homes. Simple supply and demand, right? But something changed. Since the 2007 subprime mortgage crisis, home prices in these same cities have skyrocketed, outpacing the national average. And here's the kicker. These are all the cities where corporate investors are most active, buying up homes by the thousands. If relaxed zoning and supply were the solution, why isn't it working in cities where it's easiest to build new homes? Now, the reality is that supply is important. We absolutely need to build more housing. And many municipalities in Canada must remove unnecessary barriers to supply. Restrictive zoning laws have made it far too difficult to build multifamily housing in cities that desperately need more density. and we should be making it easier, not harder, to build the kinds of homes that support a growing population. But supply alone isn't enough. The demand from investors who are buying up the very homes that end users need is outpacing new construction. This isn't about capital funding new developments, it's about speculative capital flooding the market, snapping up homes before families even get a chance. No matter how much we build, investor demand is growing even faster, driving up prices beyond what local incomes can support. Without policies that curb speculative investment, new housing supply will continue to be funneled into the hands of investors rather than families. If we want real affordability, we need to stop pretending that supply alone can fix this crisis. A system that allows investors to outbid families at every turn will keep prices high no matter how much we build. For decades, we've been taught certain economic truths about housing. That home prices should be constrained by incomes, that over the long term, housing is not a great investment, and that places where builders can rapidly increase supply, home prices should remain stable. But today, none of these ideas seem to hold. Investors, both individual and institutional, are buying homes in record numbers. Home prices continue to soar even in places where supply is abundant, and the dream of homeownership is slipping away for an entire generation. Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Shiller once said that housing is traditionally not a great investment because home prices in the 100 years before 1990 didn't really appreciate in value after adjusting for inflation. But if that's true, why have Wall Street and Bay Street firms been pouring billions of dollars into buying homes? Are they clueless? Or is the role that housing plays in our society different today from the role it played in the 100 years before 1990? And for years, housing economists told us that the reason home prices were rising was simple. Cities were restricting new supply. But as we've already discussed, their theories don't add up. In the cities where it's easiest to build homes, home prices are rising far more rapidly than the rest of the country. And these are the markets where big corporate investors are most active. If supply alone determined affordability, why hasn't it kept homes affordable in those markets? What we're seeing is not just an economic anomaly, it's a paradigm shift. Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, argued that scientific progress happens in phases. For a long time, people worked with an accepted framework until the anomalies pile up. Eventually, the old model no longer explains reality and a new paradigm takes over. For much of the post-World War II 20th century, home ownership was about stability. You bought a home, you paid off your mortgage, and you built equity for retirement. But today, the entire system has changed. Homes are no longer just places to live, they're financial assets. The dominant buyers are no longer just families, they're investors, corporations, and private equity firms using sophisticated algorithms to bid on homes before families even get a chance to view them. Former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Pasalis has described the future of housing as one where families won't buy their homes outright. Instead, corporate landlords will own homes, and families will just buy a small share of their landlord's property. Pasalis' vision is not about increasing homeownership. It's about replacing homeownership with a model where corporations own more of our homes and individuals own less. It's a future where families have less autonomy, less financial security, and less control over the living conditions. And it's the path we are currently on. For decades, we were told that house prices couldn't rise indefinitely because they were constrained by income. But that's obviously no longer true. House prices today are driven by capital, not wages. Families trying to buy a home with their income alone are being outbid by investors with deep pockets, and in the case of large corporate investors, unlimited capital. The housing market we live in today is not the same as the one our parents grew up in. The old rules don't apply anymore. The question is, are we going to keep pretending we can solve this crisis with outdated ideas? Or are we finally ready to acknowledge that the housing system has been hijacked and that we need a fundamental change in how we think about housing. Over the past 2 decades, Canada has transformed its housing market into one of the most expensive and inaccessible in the world. Homeownership rates are declining, prices remain out of reach for many, and investors are buying more homes than ever before. So can we make housing affordable again? There's no single cause for Canada's housing crisis. Investor demand, population growth, low interest rates, and limited supply all play a role. But the uncomfortable truth is that Canada's high home prices are a deliberate policy choice. Our system encourages housing as an investment rather than a basic affordable need. Reversing that, it won't be easy, but we can still shape a better future, one where homes are for people and not just for profit. At the heart of this debate lies a fundamental question. Should housing be a wealth-building tool for investors or an affordable, stable foundation for families? Canada has embraced housing as a wealth-building tool. Investors own a growing share of the market, and governments actively encourage corporate ownership of homes. And as former Housing Minister Ahmed Hussein put it, investor ownership is seen as part of the solution, not the problem. But this vision comes at a cost. It leaves those without homes with fewer choices. Either they rent from investors who dominate the housing market or are forced to leave the communities they call home. But there's another path, one where homes are protected as a foundation for family stability and generational security, where an average family earning an average income, saving at an average rate, can afford an average home. This vision prioritizes owner-occupied housing over investor-owned housing. It ensures homes remain within reach of Canadians rather than becoming an asset class dominated by global capital. And it recognizes that families shouldn't have to compete with billion-dollar corporations using algorithms to buy homes before they even hit the market. To paraphrase former CMHC head George Anderson, Canada must jealously protect its stock of owner-occupied homes. Now, banning investors outright won't work. It's about changing incentives. So it's harder for them to buy homes and less profitable for them to hoard them. This allows first-time buyers to get an edge. So how do we do that? First is increasing down payment requirements. Right now, investors can buy a home which is 20% down. Increasing that to 35% would make it harder for them to leverage cheap credit to scoop up properties. And the second is increasing transaction taxes on investment properties. Other countries charge investors additional land transfer taxes on non-primary residents, and Canada should follow suit. Now, helping first-time buyers doesn't mean pushing them deeper into debt. It means giving them a fair shot, especially when they're competing against investors. One way to do that: remove the GST on the first $1 million of the purchase price of a newly built home when it's bought by a first-time buyer. And this does two important things. First, it gives first-time buyers a slight advantage because an investor competing for the same property would still have to pay GST. Second, it encourages the construction of new homes by directing demand towards new supply rather than existing resale homes. Now, those measures make it harder for investors to buy homes and give first-time buyers a slight edge when buying a new home. The more important next step is making owning homes a less lucrative investment. So what can be done? Firstly, eliminating mortgage interest deductions for investors. The United Kingdom banned this tax break, making rental properties less profitable, and Canada should consider doing the same. And second is taxing capital gains from investment properties at the same rate as income. Right now, money from work is taxed higher than money from owning homes. This fuels investor-driven demand and makes housing unattainable for working families. As Scott Galloway puts it, for some reason, we've decided the money makes should be taxed lower than the money sweat makes. And that's the reality of Canada's housing system. It's not designed to help families. It's designed to help investors who are hoarding Canada's homes. But this isn't just about housing. It's about Canada's economy. Right now, investing in housing is the easiest way to build wealth. So that's where money flows. But when capital is parked in real estate instead of businesses, Canada falls behind. Among 38 OECD countries, Canada ranks near the bottom for GDP per capita growth, a key measure of productivity and prosperity. Other countries invest in innovation, productivity, and job creation. Meanwhile, Canada has built an economy where the best way to get rich isn't to invent, create, or build anything. It's to own houses and wait for prices to rise. If we want a more dynamic, prosperous economy, we need a system that channels investment into productive sectors, innovation, entrepreneurship, and industry, rather than unproductive, extractive investments like owning homes. Now, I can already hear the pushback, but what about free markets? Won't more intervention just make things worse? That argument might hold up if housing were truly a free market, but it's not, and it never has been. The government constantly intervenes in housing through mortgage insurance, tax incentives, and financing programs. And here's the hypocrisy. Many of the same people who champion free markets are the first to demand government intervention when it benefits them. Builders don't want to borrow at true market interest rates. They want the government to lend them money at ultra low rates. They advocate for preferential tax treatment. And today, through blanket appraisals, banks and the government are effectively bailing out new condo investors whose units are worth far less than what they paid. They're fine with governments meddling in the housing market as long as it prioritizes their interests. But when policies shift to put the interests of Canadian households first, suddenly they cry foul. This isn't really a debate about free markets. It's about whether we want government policies to continue prioritizing the financial interests of investors or start focusing on making housing more affordable for Canadian households. Let's address another common criticism we're going to hear. That taxing capital gains on investment properties as income or raising barriers to real estate investors is socialist. But let's be clear about what socialism actually is. Under a true socialist system, private property is state-owned, not in the hands of individuals. One of the most famous free market economists, Friedrich Hayek, warned about centralized ownership. He wrote, "The system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but scarcely less for those who do not." Hayek feared what happens when ownership becomes too concentrated, where a single entity like the state controls everything. But here's the thing. The threat today isn't state ownership. It's corporate and investor consolidation. Fewer families own homes while ownership is concentrating into the hands of the wealthiest few. And if this trend continues, we risk moving towards a system that increasingly resembles feudalism, not socialism. The last time we saw this kind of consolidation of property, the Middle Ages. Land was controlled by aristocrats, and everyone else, they were tenants, renters. They had no stake in the land, no path to ownership, no security, and no freedom. That's the trajectory we're on. And it's not because of big government. It's because housing has been financialized, turning our homes into someone else's business. But here's the good news. Right now, Canada is seeing a boom in purpose-built rental housing thanks to government interventions. By removing GST on rental housing and offering lower-cost financing to developers, our government has made it easier to build new rental homes. This proves that government policies can shape housing markets for the better. But we're at a crossroads. We can either continue selling off Canada's housing stock to investors and shut the next generation out of homeownership, or we can start jealously protecting our homes for families. Now is the time to act. If we want housing to be affordable for the next generation, it needs to be a less lucrative investment for this generation. There are no shortcuts. If you believe housing should be a home first and not a business, share this video, because if we don't fight for this now, we may never get another chance.